Hello, my name is Angela Slaughter, and I'm a volunteer for the American Red Cross. Specifically, I serve as a supervisor of the disaster assessment process for the cities of Hampton and Newport News and Isle of Wight County. If you're watching this video, it's because you've expressed an interest in the disaster assessment function area, and it's an area of great importance during a disaster. So I created this video to kind of give you the who, what, where, when, and why of disaster assessment. If you have any additional questions, you can direct those to the attention of the disaster services coordinator or the volunteer recruiter, and they should be able to either put you in touch with the right people to get answers to your questions. They might even refer you directly to me, or be able to answer the questions and provide those additional answers that you need. Okay, so who are the disaster assessors? The disaster assessors are a group of specially trained volunteers that have been trained to identify damage, how to measure it on site. And when I say measure it on site, I'm talking about they can, even from the street, a lot of times assess a level of damage because of their training. And then they move through the affected areas and collect that information. So the volunteers that work in disaster assessment typically are high energy volunteers that like to be out in the actual disaster after the disaster strikes. They may or may not use their own vehicles in going out and doing the disaster assessment. They might even be a bit of adrenaline junkies because, as you know, when a disaster strikes, you never know the condition of the streets or the roads or where you're going, and you're still kind of operating in the blind a little bit because you don't know the full magnitude of the disaster. So disaster assessors typically savor storms to a certain extent, and it's terrible to say that somebody would enjoy their work during a disaster, but and I'm not saying that they're insensitive or they're cold. I'm just saying that they don't have a problem and they're not adverse into really getting out into the community after disaster strikes and serving in that capacity. And sometimes disaster assessors will come in and they may work in a given jurisdiction or a given area for maybe 10 or 12 hours, or they may only need to go out and assess the damage on one or two affected properties. But either way, during disaster, they play a key role in determining who gets service delivery and what type of service delivery they get based upon the data that they collect. Another quality that the disaster assessors have is that they tend to like to work in small groups. They tend to prefer working with the assets that are affected during a disaster rather than the people. Not everyone is good at working with clients during a disaster. You know, that takes a very sensitive, empathetic, warm-hearted type of person, and not everyone can do that on a sustaining level during a disaster. So this is a way for people who prefer to work with property damage rather than people damage. This is a way for them to really be part of the disaster services team during a disaster. Disaster assessors also tend to push into these different areas. They may have to walk some of the areas that are being affected. They may drive through some of the areas that are affected, and they may or may not come in contact with the property owners, and so they need to really know how to handle themselves in the field. They're typically very independent, and typically we team them up with another person so that they're not alone in the disaster areas. And then they are more of a number crunching type of mentality where they like to collect the information and they tend to like to investigate the damage that's going on. So that is basically who a disaster assessment volunteer is. And their job is basically to assess, view the damage, record the damage as it's supposed to be recorded, and then report that damage back to the chapter. And the way we use that information is we calculate the numbers and the number of homes impacted, the number of families affected, and then we report that data into the people who supervise the shelter and the bulk distribution and the feeding processes. as well as the fundraising and the public information people. We report all that information in so that decisions can be made by them on what type of service delivery needs to occur in these impacted communities. So it can be a tedious job, it can be a tiring job, but for those that really like being out in it, then this would be a good place for you to start. So where do we do disaster assessments? Well, typically the areas that we know are going to be impacted are your coastal communities. Could also be near inland rivers, inland creeks, and streams, as well as areas that are just naturally low-lying areas and accumulate water for whatever reason. So these are the areas that we go into. We obviously don't want to put safety at risk or our vehicles at risk, but we are not leaving the scene of the disaster. We are going toward it. And that's kind of the mentality that a disaster assessor has to have, is that kind of a brave mentality in going into these areas and being persistent in getting the job done and having a real commitment of being able to stick to the task until it is complete. So we know where some of these areas are in Hampton and Newport News and Allouette County, and even you yourself probably can think of a lot of areas, like even on your own, that flood even during a thunderstorm. So if they flood during a thunderstorm, they're definitely going to flood during a Cat 1 hurricane or under other types of disasters that would pose that risk. When do we go out? Well, we could go out immediately after the disaster strikes. We typically wait until the Emergency Operations Center with the jurisdictional authorities authorizes our activities. And as soon as it's daylight, we will start sending the disaster assessors out into these different areas. And you'll have guidance as far as where you need to go and what we anticipate the shape of the infrastructure is. If there's blocked roads, we hope to have that information, but you could find yourself going into a location and you almost get there and find out that you really can't access it. So you call that information back into the chapter, and then we're able to reassign you to another area or to give you additional information that we have learned. So if it is a tornado and the tornado hits in the middle of the night, we might go out at sunrise. We might also go out in the middle of the night. It all depends on what type of disaster it is, how many people are impacted, and what the jurisdictional emergency management authorities are going to request from the Red Cross. But regardless, the Red Cross has now authorized that disaster assessment activities can occur 24 hours a day. So as long as it's safe and well lit, and our volunteers are in a situation where they can get there, you can expect to be able to participate in disaster assessment at any given hour of the day. How do we do this? Well, that's for a later video because it can get tedious in explaining the whole process, but basically what happens is the Emergency Operations Center will activate in the jurisdiction, whether it's Hampton or Newport News or Allouette County, and then the American Red Cross will activate their disaster management team that will, each person, such as myself, is responsible for a given service delivery area. So once we know we've been activated, we start looking at what we can expect from the disaster. Now, the disaster strikes, in our area it's typically a hurricane, but keep in mind it can be a tornado, it can be a microburst, it could be flooding, it could be any combination of natural disasters, and even some man-made disasters are possible. But what we do is we send the disaster assessors once the disaster strikes and we are activated, we wait for the Emergency Operations Center with the jurisdictional authorities to give us the go-ahead to go into the field, and then we start calling our disaster assessors and saying, okay, we're ready, can you go ahead and do the disaster assessment for your area? And then you will either walk it or drive it, depending on the circumstances. And then you will call that information into the chapter. And then once your section is done, you come into the chapter and find out what areas are still remaining to be done as far as disaster assessment. You pick up more forms, you go back out in the field, go into these other areas that have been impacted. Now, as that data is coming in, The people who are responsible for the reporting, which those people, myself and my co-chair, Charlotte Saylor, they will turn that information in, and then we calculate the numbers. We file a report at least once a day, but it could be 2 or 3 times a day. So it's important that when your numbers come in, they're accurate. And then we share that information with the DMT, with the national chapter if it's necessary, and also with the Emergency Operations Center in each of the cities and the Allouez County. So that's basically the process. Now, in the beginning, things may be really slow because until police and fire give us permission to go into some of these areas, we're kind of playing a little bit of a waiting game. But that process normally, that waiting game usually is not quite long enough. And then we find out that we have to go into the field. The disaster assessment function can take anywhere from an hour or 2, given the circumstances, to maybe all day or several days. And it's during that second phase where we really need volunteers to get the work done and get it done quickly and get the information back in the chapter. Then, after the majority of the disaster assessment's done, we still may be getting calls from the city, from the emergency operations centers, even from other chapters of the Red Cross, to go out and check individual homes, to assess damage in specific areas. And although we don't need as many volunteers during that third part of the disaster assessment function, it's still necessary for people to be available for that. So what we try to do is we try to have the bulk of our disaster assessors working during the second phase, and then maybe returning the disaster assessment function over to 1 or 2 specific volunteers or the DAT team during the final stages of the reporting. So I hope this gives you kind of a good idea of what we're doing. I want to invite you to look at the other videos that have been done by other chapters regarding their disaster assessment operations. And I've also got a briefing video that's available on YouTube that you can take a look at. And it's called Pre-Deployment Briefing. So that may be one that you want to watch. And also there is a training briefing as well. And you may also want to look at that because that will actually be used to give our team members refreshers before disaster strikes so they're ready to go out in the field. Thank you so much.